come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 81 All Out Podcast, where we're going to review the most exciting World Cup final to date and quite possibly the best one-day match ever played. I'm your host, Subhash Jayaraman at Cricket Couch on Twitter, and I'm joined by two good people from the land of the most recent world champions, Daniel Norcross, who's with BBC Test Match Special as commentator, and Chris Smith, who writes thoughtful cricket pieces at the Declaration Game blog. Welcome to the show, gents.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Subhash.
Absolute pleasure. I don't want to assume just because you live in England, you're England cricket fans. Are you England cricket fans?
Yeah. Well, do you know, I may have mentioned this before on this podcast. I didn't think that I was really, except that the nature of what you do when you follow the team around is that you sort of develop, it's kind of Stockholm syndrome, but also it's sort of an entirely human response to people. And because you see those people and, you know, you have to interview those people and you sort of have eyebrow raising contact with them, you end up wanting them to do well for them, because that's just a human response to relationships that get developed over time. I didn't realize just how much I wanted them to win for them, I suppose, until last 20 minutes of that match, when what I was thinking really was not how much I wanted England to win in order to prove the superiority of the master race, and so that we could hurtle onto Twitter and find every single Indian and Australian fan who said, "You're rubbish, you'll never win the World Cup," and stick it back in their face. Although that obviously, it sounds like I'd off protest too much, but I genuinely wasn't wanting it for that. I sort of wanted it because I don't think I could have borne the look of puppy dog misery in dear Chris Woakes' eyes, you know, or just knowing all the effort. And I know everybody puts in effort, but when you know the people who've put in the effort, you sort of think, oh God, it would have been absolutely devastating to lose that match, which of course the New Zealanders didn't do either, except they didn't get to lift the trophy. I think I discovered deep down that I wanted those people to win. Whether that makes me an England fan or not, I'm not quite sure.
How about you, Chris?
I've got a bit more distance than Dan, and I can tell you very honestly that I wanted them to win for me.
That's fair. That's fair. You know?
Yes, no, I wanted that pleasure of supporting the world champions, and having supported that team for 4 decades or more, I wanted that pleasure. And so it was odd the way it happened.
Has the feeling of now you live in a country that has won a men's 50-over trophy for the first time, and that the futility of the last 44 years have been washed away in one swift wave of boundary count back?
Well, having never had the experience before, I've got nothing to compare it to. But it hasn't changed my life. And I do think that's something about how the game ended. I can only compare it, I guess, to the 2005 Ashes. And that did leave me with a glow for weeks. Haven't quite had that, but it was just such a thrill to be watching that game. And that was sufficient, to be honest. So, yeah, I went into it as an England fan, wanting England to win. And I've come away from it, I think, just delighted to be able to watch it. And I was watching it with friends and with family, and it was a pure delight.
I sort of concur with that, but I think that it's just, I don't know whether it's tainted. It's not that it's tainted, it's just that if we could have won like that against Australia or India, it would have been absolutely beautiful.
Yes.
The sheer agony and the wailing and the screaming that would have come out of both of those camps would have just allowed us to play the pantomime villain again and twirl the imaginary moustache in the black and white. But because it was New Zealand, it felt like we were drowning kittens, you know. It felt like you can't do that to these guys. They're just undeniably lovely in every way. And my heart broke for them. I was lucky enough to be in the Lords. commentating for an Australian station, and I'd started really loving it, because I had Damien Fleming next to me, and I was able to say, so, Damo, what's Australian cricket got to do in the next 4 years to catch up with England? Because they're clearly light years behind,
Mm-hmm.
I was dripping in condescension. I was sort of loving all that whole pantomime nonsense. But then the reality struck, which was that, I have good friends who are New Zealanders, and I went up to the TMS box, and there was Jeremy Coney and Brian Waddle, and they were doing their best to be as dignified as they could be in the teeth of the most awful provocation. It was, England were luckier in winning, you know what I mean,
yes,
becoming world champions than any side will ever be, which is not to say, I really want to make it clear that it's not to say that I don't think England are a worthy champions. They were fantastic. They were fantastic in this tournament. They've been fantastic for 4 years. They've got terrific players. But just to do that to Kiwis just felt like, isn't it bad enough what we did to India and the Caribbean and indigenous Australians and all the things that you can throw at Britain as a culture, and then we take the loveliest people in cricket, we beat them over the head with a technicality. So I felt compromised by it. I did think there was an obvious solution. I couldn't understand, why don't we have another super over? You play football, and if you're 5-all after penalties, you have sudden death. If you're 6-all, you have another penalty. I mean, just do it again. But they didn't, and then that happened, and then we had to deal with Kiwis being the most wonderful and dignified and terrific people, which I think in a way they sort of won. They won sport and we won the World Cup.
Chris mentioned something about the afterglow after the 2005 Ashes. Do you have anything of the sort? Or it hasn't sunk in, or where are you emotionally?
Well, where I am emotions, I still keep on crying every now and then. I haven't been able to stop doing that for the last 3 days because I keep on coming on podcasts and reliving the bloody moments, Sebastian. So thanks for that.
I'm terribly sorry, Daniel.
But I mean, it's because the emotions were so high that day, and because the atmosphere was so extraordinary, and actually because so much mattered for English cricket. I mean, the things that I've really taken on board since the day are all those Twitter clips of different people in different pubs and people at Trafalgar Square. But the thing is really important, and people from other countries won't totally understand that, because here in India, it's a national sport. In Australia, it's a national sport. And so there's no real fear of the game dying. But in England, there is, I think. I think Chris would feel the same. We're always paranoid and anxious about what we need to do to just get anybody to watch the game. And then that game unfolded, the first game on free-to-air television since 2005, and it was the most ludicrous and remarkable game of cricket anyone's ever seen. And it was like we've been given this grand opportunity, and so all the emotions flooded out from all the people who love the game, and it was infectious. But of course, being English, the first thing that happened was, so we don't need the bloody 100 then. And we start attacking ourselves again. So it's as it's always going to be with sport. It's always compromising but magnificent.
Chris, you organize and play cricket at the Sale Cricket Club in Manchester area, and you deal with youngsters a lot, including your own kids. How has the effects been amongst the future generations of cricket fans, and especially and quite possibly England cricket fans?
Well, I sat and watched the game with two friends and our son. So there were 4 lads sitting with us. Only one of whom, which is my older son, is really a committed cricketer. But I think the other 3 lads really got the bug. Particularly, I'm pleased my younger son did, because he gave up cricket last year, and he's actually agreed he's going to play for the 4th 11 for Sale with me on Sunday. So 3 Smiths are going to turn out for the 4th 11 on Sunday. So that's an early and local victory. So I'm very pleased about that. I mean, as Dan says, there's definitely a buzz around the country now about it. But as Dan said, we're English, and so we'll look at the other side of things. And I'm already anxious. Am I having as many conversations today about cricket as I did the day before? Are we already in diminishing interest? And I just want to see that level of excitement maintained. I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but there's plenty of people who want to. Listening to people, someone like Dan, if Dan's voice can be heard widely, then that's got to be good, hasn't it? Listening to someone talk with that passion and excitement about the game.
I mean, they made the late call to put it on free-to-air, Daniel, as you said, and it went up against basically Wimbledon, Crown Jewel, and Silverstone race. How do you think, because you are a man in the media, how do you think cricket ended up faring against competition that day, and the scope of the free-to-air, and what's going to come next year with the 100?
Well, firstly, I want to say just why did it? I mean, it was absolutely stupid. They should obviously have played the game on Saturday, and absolutely no disrespect to the women's Wimbledon final, but that would have reduced at least one of the different competing problems, which would have been the actual race in Formula One. But also, whether we like it or not, fewer people do watch the women's Wimbledon final to the men's Wimbledon final. It was so obvious that they should have played the semi-finals on Monday and Wednesday and then play the final on Saturday, because the reserve day would have then been Sunday anyway. So beyond ludicrous. I think it probably did not help that Federer played Djokovic in a magnificent final that went to 13-12 in the fifth set, would have taken quite a few watchers away. But at the same time, I can give you anecdotal evidence. I live in Tooting Beck near Clapham Junction, and there was a festival. I wasn't at it, but there was a festival just down the road. And they put out big screens. The big screen showed the cricket, it didn't show the tennis. I think they didn't anticipate showing the tennis to start with. That's why they ordered the big screens. But then the cricket came along and trumped it. 39 million people viewed the BBC's page on the cricket that day, which was the highest number of people that had ever seen any page on the BBC website, including the 2017 general election. So that was obviously grabbing people. Overall, we think the figures were 8.5, 9 million, which for cricket is big. It was 10 million for the last Ashes in 2005 that was on free-to-air. Subsequent to that, the highest viewing figures have been 1 million since it's moved to Sky per day. So it will have impacted people, and it will have made an enormous noise. Today I was at a game at Trent Bridge where I was told by Mick Newell at Nottinghamshire that the day after the World Cup final, 1,200 people bought tickets for that game, and the following day 1,500 more people bought tickets for that T20 game. So there's a sort of instant impact, and there's no doubt that in the immediate aftermath of an event that enormous, you're going to see an uplift, which is very pleasing. Your second part of your question, which is, well, is that sustainable? And is the 100 the answer to it? And will that free-to-air coverage make the difference? I don't know. I think that any free-to-air coverage will make a difference. I think that still the most remarkable thing about the World Cup is that the audiences that we saw for most of the matches, especially when Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka were playing, were the people that English cricket needs to attract to cricket more regularly. And they came in giant numbers to watch the World Cup. There were very few times where I was at a game and there were loads of empty seats. And especially if there were teams from that part of the world, you saw massive engagement, massive interest. And there were mostly people who live in England. But those people don't turn up to county cricket. Are they going to turn up to the 100? I mean, maybe if Yuvraj Singh is there, but you can't get Indian players to play in it who haven't left India, left Indian cricket. So you can only get the sort of retirees or the people who are virtually dead. AB de Villiers might bring in some people, but those aren't really the fans we're talking about. So I don't know. I think there are still an enormous number of challenges for English cricket to address. But a moment like this can't help. It can't fail to help, can it? I mean, I think it's going to be one of those days that everyone's going to remember, and it's going to be on Sports Personality of the Year. It's going to be the England team are going to be trotted out. People will know who Ben Stokes is. People will know who Josh Butler is, and that's a large part of what it is. There's a saying that a lot of feminists quite rightly say, which is you can't be what you can't see. And that's been kind of true of cricket for quite a long time.
I'd certainly echo that, Dan. I mean, working with lots of kids cricket to me has felt like a game without heroes in England. So kids like hitting a ball, they like throwing a ball, they like all the physical aspects of it. But their understanding and knowledge of players is really scant. And so you've got someone like Stokes, Butler, and their performances that have been seen are really important because there are the people who they can aspire to be. So I think that's really positive. Just something local that's occurred to me though, that's a bit of a negative, is that the junior cricket season runs alongside the school term. Kids break up this week. So all of us club coaches, we're actually running down our season right now. Just when there's an opportunity, of course, lots of kids should be enthused who might want to be playing cricket. But all the league games are finished. Most of our training evenings will be finishing this week or next. So that's a bit disappointing about that disjuncture in timing.
I think there are all sorts of problems with the 100, and I think it's part of exactly what Chris was talking about there, which is creating heroes and creating narratives. Very hard to create a narrative in 5-6 weeks. Yeah. With infected notions that of Manchester and Oval and Lords and what have you. And then when you've got a kid who might be enthused by it, especially happening over the summer holidays, it disappears for 10 and a half months. So how do you sort of keep that child interested? Now, I don't know the answer to that. And I think these are existential problems that English cricket has forced on itself from the moment it went off free to air. But it's not, let's just be clear about this, it's not just the ECB that's to blame, it is our entire nation, because of the way that we've constructed our economy and how we've imagined the right things to be and how we've thought broadcasting works. It wasn't really going to be possible for free-to-air broadcasters to be able to afford this content or find space in the schedules for them to do it, given that they were sort of piecemeal individual channels, whereas something like Sky can create multiple channels. So this isn't just on the ECB, this is on us as a nation about how we have decided to structure and organise our society and how we broadcast. And it's very different in Australia and India.
The Tour de France is on ITV4, free to air, for 6-7 hours a day in the UK at the moment.
Yeah. So yes, but it's dead cheap, isn't it? Because who's producing it for them? I mean, they're effectively taking a world feed and putting it onto a separate channel, whereas what we're asking really for cricket to do is, if it's to go onto free to air, they've got to take on board the enormous costs of production and going from place to place and paying the people to do this and then throwing enough money back to the board. You know, it's not, unfortunately, as simple as we would like it to be. What we need to do is, if we care about these things, instead of having a go at the BBC and saying, I can't believe that Gary Lineker gets paid £1 million, say to yourself, well, how come you get 4 TV channels and loads of regional channels and radio channels and God knows what else for a quarter of the price of buying a copy of the Daily Mail newspaper every day for a year? And if we had any kind of political consciousness or sense or understanding, then we would be able to look after ourselves a lot better. But we don't. But, you know, we're also uniquely positioned to be kinder to ourselves. You know, we have this institution which is actually working really well. We spend most of our time lambasting it, when for 155, 160 quid a year, you get phenomenal amounts of content which are not produced by other private companies. Now, if we increased the license fee by 20, 30 quid, then these things would all fall into our laps if we wanted them to. But that's not where the political argument currently is. So instead, cricket fans are left arguing, really howling into the wind, because I don't see that there's a solution that they would like.
Let's focus on the game itself. Obviously, there are portions of the game that are now, for the Mount Rushmore of ODI cricket forever. It's going to be there, especially starting with the 48th over, 49-50, and then going into super over and all that. And we have already talked about all those things in this podcast itself, another episode. I want to talk about stuff that happened before the 48th over of England's innings, and the New Zealand innings, which nobody seems to remember now. Chris, I'll start with you. Are there any passages from the first 97 overs of the match that stand out for you in retrospect?
Yes, I mean, I think the sort of the false trails that were laid, particularly once Williamson was out. I think as an England supporter, I was feeling relatively confident. It was all very tense because it was a final. Mm-hmm. But from Williamson's dismissal, which was, I think, 21st, 22nd over, something like that, the New Zealand innings never took off, which it hadn't done against India in the semi-final either. But plenty of reason for England to be confident. And the big question mark was whether or not England were going to be able to get through Bolt and Henry's initial spell. Mm. And we lost Roy, and Roy's been talismanic, but it seemed okay to me. First 10 overs, just one wicket down. Root was there. Wasn't a big total they were chasing. So I think for a big portion of the game, there were real false trails being laid that, for an England supporter, made me feel very confident. And it was de Grandhomme coming into the attack and really causing all sorts of problems, particularly for Root, where things started to go awry and where the whole tension and the build-up of the day, I thought, really started to move from there.
I agree with that entirely, again, unfortunately. The Grandhomme's spell was really brilliantly pedestrian, both ways, and I mean that in the nicest possible way. He absolutely just stuck to a very simple game plan. I mean, I don't think that he didn't really go with varieties. He didn't try to do anything particularly different. He just took pace off the ball. He did exactly what Jeremy Coney was screaming for the bowlers to do later on, actually, in the commentary box. You could hear him slightly off mic going, just don't bowl it so fast. Because the faster they bowled it, the greater likelihood the ball was going to fly around the place. The Grandhomme spell was superb. And it was a wonderful sort of indicator also, because Root gets into these problems against those kind of bowlers that when you're that good, when you're as good as Root, you're playing the ball so late and using the pace to basically manipulate the ball around, and that's how you're scoring at nearly a run a ball, because he's not a powerful hitter, is he? When there's no pace on the ball, his frustration was extraordinary. And it was one time when he sort of came back into the pack, he almost felt like if you played club cricket with him, I'd like to see what you do now, mate, because we have to these bowlers all the bloody time, and they're a nightmare. And ordinarily, there's some gigantically marvellous 40-year-old fat bloke who plants his foot down the ground and hits Colin de Grandhomme for 6 over long off and does that over and over again, because 75 miles per hour is just perfect for him. But for Joe Root, it wasn't. There were also, I think, in terms of passages of play, I asked Jared Kimber on commentary. I was getting slightly worried as the rate increased to 7.5, 8 and over when Joss Buttler and Ben Stokes were there. Everyone was saying, well, they're together, and if they can stay together, they'll win the game. And it was true that Buttler was timing the ball better than anyone in the game and was going very comfortably to run a ball and looked immaculate. But Stokes wasn't. He looked in all sorts of bother. He was struggling really to get off strike. I asked Jared, what's the most number of runs that have been scored in a 5-over stretch during this match? And this was about 32, 33 overs into England's innings. Mm-hmm. And he said 36 is the most number of runs scored in a 5-over stretch. And that was between overs 43 and 47 in the New Zealand innings. Yeah. So that made me think, hello, if this rate gets to 8, 9, then there's no complacency just because it's Ben Stokes and Joss Buttler. If they've got to get 8 and over and they've got to do that for 15 overs, that's going to be really tough, because the most record is 7.2 in one 5-over stretch at the back end of New Zealand's innings. So I sensed massive anxiety developing even during that partnership, which was sort of effectively piecing the innings back together, wasn't it?
Yep. When Buttler actually finally got out, England needed 45 still, and as it happened, Ben Stokes got 33 of that, and 10 of that from Plunkett. And Plunkett had a fantastic day. You guys want to talk about his bowling?
Sure. Now, Dan, you're a Surrey fan, aren't you?
I am, yeah.
Did you see Plunkett play for Surrey early this season?
I did, and it was hard to watch. It was absolutely all over the place. I didn't think that he was going to come back from that. He was going in. I mean, in 4-day games, he was going at 6, 7 and over. He was clearly lacking any kind of rhythm at all. He looked all over the place. But
I was all for him being dropped, I must say. I didn't think he should be in the squad.
Well, I can understand that, because if you've seen him earlier on in the season, it just looked like he'd lost it. But he's clever, and I'm with Sebastian on this. One of the weird things about Plunkett is I think that all of us in our mind's eye have an idea of how we see bowlers getting people out. You know, we all have an idea of how Jasprit Bumrah is going to get you out, or Mitchell Stark, or even Chris Wokes, or Jofra Archer, whoever you want to choose. But with Plunkett, he's got more wickets in these middle overs in the last 4 years than anyone else. And yet, in your mind's eye, how has he got those wickets? Because they're guided to backward point, they're caught at deep mid-wicket, they're shanked to extra cover, they're all over the place. You know, he takes wickets any which way, which is, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, I mean it, the exact opposite, really, is that he's an absolute master of his craft, and that he recognises that in the middle overs, you don't really, you can get people out any which way. He's totally unpredictable. Dharmasena, I know he's quoting Dharmasena is a tricky thing at the moment because his judgment's been slightly awry in the last couple of games, but he said to Paul Farbrace during the match against India, when India were going really well with Kohli and Sharma, said, well, Plunkett was the only guy at that point who had just gone cross-seam, and in doing so, he was getting the balls to pop off a length when it hit the seam and then skid through when it hit the leathery part of the ball, giving the impression that the pitch was actually losing pace, was becoming too pacey and a bit awkward. But in fact, it was the skill of Plunkett's bowling, and he communicated that, Plunkett did, to the other bowlers, and England's whole style of bowling changed in behind it. So it's not just the way he bowls, I think, it's actually what he derives from his bowling and what he then communicates to the other bowlers. I think he's a really, really important part of that team. When he was out of the team, England didn't look as good. When he was in it, they basically won matches. So, yeah, it was no great surprise that he was pivotal during New Zealand's innings.
I mean, I thought Plunkett coming into the side, they play 11 in place of Moeen Ali, and Jason Roy getting back to close to peak health. That basically meant England were pretty much unbeatable. Once those two were back in the 11, they were the best side in the competition. And even if for someone that does not ever root for England, I thought the best team gets to keep the trophy. So there is some consolation there.
I'm just thinking back to, we were talking a little earlier about the Butler-Stokes partnership. And as you said, Dan, it ended up, well, it all the way through, the required run rate increased. Whereas, you had these two very attacking batsmen together, but not actually grabbing the game by the scruff of the neck, but taking it deep. And one of the things that I questioned several times during the World Cup was whether the Dhoni orthodoxy, the Dhoni orthodoxy of always trying to take the chase deep is correct, and whether or not some teams, and possibly England in the World Cup, although obviously it worked out well in the end, shouldn't have looked at overs 35 to 40 before the fifth fielder goes out on the boundary, before the opening bowlers come back to complete their spells. Shouldn't have looked at that period as an opportunity to attack more. And in this case, perhaps try and control that run rate, bring it down, level it out at 7, rather than let it grow again to 8.5, 9.
Do you know, I agree with you. I think though that the problem is that once they got into the knockout stages, and they were sort of in the knockout stages for the last 5 matches, England, they adopted that approach in the first couple of games, because that sort of was the approach, wasn't it? We go hard, we go heavy, put the pressure back on the bowlers, we have faith in our tail, and we stop that rate from getting too high. But they got into their heads, I think. There was a little bit of criticism because of the way they'd approached the game against Pakistan, which was a relatively high run chase, and people had got out and not supported Butler. And then they got into their shell against Sri Lanka and tried to be sensible and do plan B, when really they needed to just execute plan A better. Because you're right, they were in serious danger by taking it deep. And sometimes you don't really want to take it deep, actually. What you want to do is not have to take it deep. They were slightly hampered, of course, by losing those 4 wickets. If you lose those 4 wickets, then you've got to make a judgment about how you're going to go about it. And I think that there's also, if we're really honest about this, they weren't necessarily trying to take it deep, as Joss Butler was going at a run of ball, which was great. And poor old Ben Stokes was really struggling to get the ball off the square and was going nowhere near a run of ball. So, if Stokes had been as fluent as Butler, then it wouldn't have gone so deep. At one point, he had sort of 50 off 80 odd, didn't he, I think, Stokes? So, had that been 65 off 80, then the game looks completely different, and England are coasting. And then, actually, Butler doesn't have to play that shot. And it's a little bit analogous to what happened in the run chase that India had against New Zealand. And that's why it sort of felt like Groundhog Day. It really felt that New Zealand were doing to England what they'd done to India. When Jadeja was going strong and Dhoni was stuck, Jadeja, as the rate went higher and higher and higher, and realised the quality of New Zealand's bowlers meant that he was going to have to go for it, went for it, got out, and then everything collapsed. The difference between India and England, I think, was a combination of extraordinary good fortune and Liam Plunkett, which you alluded to earlier.
Yep.
His 10, and the boundary through mid-wicket that he hit was absolutely crucial, because if England had needed 21 off the last over, forget it. But just it being 15, it still allowed Stokes scope to try, and and then as I said, we can talk about it, the most outlandish pieces of good fortune that also landed their lap. But those bits of good fortune don't win you the game unless you've had that 10 from Plunkett. Of
course, and I want to briefly touch upon the pitch itself. It gave for very absorbing cricket. No batsman, except for maybe Butler, and for a short period, Jimmy Neesham, looked to be able to hit as they pleased. Even Butler had some initial struggles, but then quickly got over it because he's a freaking genius. There were some murmurs I was reading from some of the journalists about, this is just a drab pitch. How could you have this kind of pitch for a World Cup final, even if it's on free-to-air? Nobody's going to be inspired to take up cricket because they're not seeing 4s and 6s. But I thought the cricket was so good. The drama of the match was so good. Do you have any strong opinions on the pitch itself?
Well, I think the pitch was critical to the spectacle that we had. But I think having that same pitch again doesn't mean you'd get that spectacle. I don't think it's the type of pitch you want to have World Cup finals on again if you could avoid it. It happened to work out well.
That's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I go along with that, because really, if we're brutally honest with ourselves, at half-time, we'd watched quite a drab spectacle. I mean, the connoisseur may say, well, what we really watched was New Zealand being very canny and getting themselves into a position where they got a total that they could defend. But in terms of spectacle, it wasn't great. It just was a little bit too on the side of the bowler, because if a bowler could execute slow ball bouncers or cutters, what have you, it just made it so claggy and difficult for the batsmen. They were relying on bowler error massively in order to be able to hit boundaries. We had so few sixes. I mean, at one point, I think even the first 6 came really late, didn't it? And New Zealand may have only hit 1 or 2 in there and things. Yeah. So I don't think that was really ideal. There are ideal pitches. I think Edgbaston's pitches in this World Cup have been terrific. The Oval's pitches have been terrific. But by the same token, this is typical of cricket fans to believe that, the ground staff wanted the pitch to be like that. They didn't. It's a function of weather, preparation, time. These aren't all controllables, and Edgbaston and the Oval are probably the two best ones for cricketing. But you're not going to not have the World Cup final at Lords, are you? Annoyingly.
Sure. I want to skip ahead to the Super Over, not the cricket itself, but the bowler for England, Jofra Archer. Young man, all of 24, and there was some remarks when his name was included in the World Cup squad from ex-players and stuff as to what it might or might not do to the team's culture, etc. So as somebody looking from the outside, I was very relieved that he was able to defend 16 and give up only 15. I was very relieved. You live in Brexit land now where folks are suspicious of people that don't look exactly like that. As the match was unfolding, I had these actual thoughts, even though I'm not there. So was I overreacting, or my suspicions in the general ballpark? What did you have any of these thoughts at all cross your mind? Either of you?
Completely. I mean, the time that I lost it on Australian radio was when I came to the end and there was summarising what had happened, and I was hideously aware of it at the time, really. But what Jofra Archer stood for me, as a person who grew up watching cricket in the 1970s, and my first experience was the Oval in 1976, and the huge numbers of West Indian British fans watching the game and seeing how they've drifted out of the game and disappeared. As a youngster, Will Slack, Roland Butcher, Norman Cowans, Neil Williams, there were loads of young black players who were playing cricket for England, and they effectively really disappeared. Michael Carberry, the last one of any great note. So Jofra Archer coming and doing this was so symbolic, was so important. And I was in awe of the fact that firstly he was entrusted by his Irish captain, which I don't know if there's that, but there might have been, that he was part of a team that was representing people from around the world. Adil Rashid, Moeen Ali, Owen Morgan himself, Jason Roy, Ben Stokes. These are all people who've got links to other countries, and that he was front and centre doing this. What was destined to become an iconic moment in British sport was just really moving to me. Really, really moving.
Does it have any impact on the wider social consciousness of United Kingdom?
Well, we hope so. And I think what you put your finger on is that consciousness of race is always very much to the fore, which in some ways can be good if it means we're being open, and in some ways it's not good if it means we're not being open and we're being closed. It was a great moment, I think, that Archer was trusted, and it was important. It came from, obviously it was from Morgan, the captain, but Morgan has shown his ability to convey his trust to his players, and I think particularly of Adil Rashid, who struggled through the early part of the tournament. Really didn't make much of an impact, did he, until the semi-final, where he bowled, was it 4 or 5 overs without much impact?
Yeah.
I think Maxwell had just hit him for a couple of sixes and he kept him going, and then bowled that wonderful over where he got
gets 2 balls, yeah.
So, Morgan really showed the way to do it, didn't he? And that was tremendous. Will there be greater learnings from it? Will there be a good impact from Archer's presence? Yeah, we really hope so, because the point that Daniel's made is that Afro-Caribbean cricketers were a big part of cricket in Britain 30 years ago. They're not nearly so visible now. Chris Jordan, I think, is perhaps the only name you missed there, Dan, when you were mentioning recent Afro-Caribbean players that played for England. And so, yes, if Archer's achievements can inspire some more people from that community, that would be wonderful.
I want to talk a bit about New Zealand. All the things, Kane Williams and the way he conducted himself in the post-match presentation and the press conferences, and the next day outside the hotel, him, Trent Bolt, Jimmy Neesham on Twitter, and Prime Minister of New Zealand, everything, the whole kitchen caboodle with New Zealand has been wonderful. We've talked a bit about England's good fortune. how do you accumulate so much bad fortune in that small amount of time? You know, as you said, it felt like drowning kittens, really. Daniel, while you were on air, did you consciously recognize the amount of good fortune that was breaking England's way and the amount of bad fortune that was breaking New Zealand's way? And did you have conversations about it on air?
Oh yeah, without completely. I mean, this was on SEN radio, so it was for Australia. So it was impossible not to. The fortune was staring you in the face. There had been bits of good fortune that had gone the other way. There was the odd wide call. There was a ball that sort of squirted past Josh Butler's legs. These things happen in games of cricket, but the most sort of obvious ones occurred at the moments of most jeopardy. And the only conclusion I could reach is that actually New Zealanders aren't the loveliest people on the planet, but are secretly devil-worshipping animal killers who are up to some kind of no good, because they couldn't possibly have gone through that without there being some higher purpose for it. Otherwise, why? It was sort of. I think it was, as I say, it was when the bits of misfortune took place. They got quite lucky early on when Henry Nicholls was given not out on review, and nobody could work out how that had happened. He was not a tall man. The ball was clearly clattering into the stumps, and then just very occasionally ball tracking has this weird thing, doesn't it, when the ball just sort of scoots up vertically and manages to miss the stumps. And they sort of brought a bit of misfortune on themselves by reviewing Guptill. Then they got bad fortune when Taylor shouldn't have been given out. They got worse fortune when Roy should have been given out the first ball of the innings. And then we go into the world of pain that is the 4 extra runs that came off Stokes' bat, which I'm fairly convinced will mean that we'll never see that again. It is one of the great and absurd anomalies of cricket that if the ball comes off your bat but dribbles down to a fielder on the boundary, you'd never run. But if the fielder's not there, the umpire has to give an extra 4 runs. It seems so absurd that I think we'll end up with that being called dead ball before awfully long. And I think it might actually extend to the ball striking the stumps when a fielder throws. I think it's one of the things that a lot of fans and players find irksome, is that a good bit of fielding is not rewarded. I mean, it takes one of the lovely eccentricities out of the game. And whilst we talk about good fortune and all that, you know, that last 4 overs was a cricket lover's dream, because it produced all the different twists and turns that have occurred in the film Lagan, and did it all in 15 minutes. Whereas I got 4 hours to build to that. It was extraordinary to watch, but I think it will result in changes. And you're right. I mean, there wasn't anybody. There was no triumphalism. I can promise you that in the press box. There was no triumphalism in the crowd. You know, loads and loads of Kiwi fans were streaming out, and England fans were hugging them and consoling them. I mean, I did much the same. Their collective dignity was extraordinary. They displayed no anger. They kept on going about what a great game of cricket it had been. Maybe it's because they don't really care about cricket. They know they're going to win the Rugby World Cup, and that's all that matters to them. I don't know. But if I'd been put in that situation, I would have found it very hard to maintain that dignity. Obviously,
most extraordinary limited overs game in the history of the sport, I suppose, because somebody's declared winner of the World Cup without really winning, and somebody by that definition becomes a loser without actually losing the game. I have one final question to both of you. Where does the ODI game go in England? You know, especially with the marginalization of the Royal London ODI Cup. You know, it has become the developmental competition, and it's going to be running alongside the 100. What is, you know, it's as if they don't want to reap the rewards of this in the 50 over format.
Yeah, it really doesn't seem as though there's a plan, because you've got that what you said about the domestic commitment to the one day to the 50 over game decreasing. But I think we're also now entering I can't remember what the ICC is calling it, but we're now entering a period where there's a formal league, isn't there, to tabulate international ODI results. Mm. And England are just not prepared for it. I was thinking through their options, and I think it might be that the A team will have to play a lot of 50-over cricket so that we can prepare players who aren't already part of the main team to take that step up, because there doesn't seem to be any sort of plan to maintain England's current prestige and position within the game.
So is this just a case of one and done, Dan, in 50 overs for England?
I don't think so, to be honest, for the reason that I think 50-over cricket has morphed a little bit. Look, I'm not saying for 1 minute that it's ideal. Obviously, there ought to be a domestic 50-over competition, but most of the players that have played for England in the last few years haven't really played in that domestic 50-over competition. Joe Root, I can't think of how many times he'd have played for Yorkshire. Roy a little bit, but once he was playing for England, not, because of the scheduling and how international cricket takes place at the same time. I'm not sure that there are that many very successful 50-over domestic competitions around the world. So I'm not quite as pessimistic about that, whilst at the same time, my issue really is not so much with developing the next group of players as what we're doing, what we're saying to people who we've got involved in cricket as a result of this wonderful moment, which is just to confuse them again and provide them with a different format that no one else is playing. You know, having infused an 8-year-old on cricket via the 100, and then they go to their next game and it's the 6 ball overs and they change every time. I think there's massive confusion. There are loads of criticisms to be levelled at the way English domestic cricket is being restructured, but I don't think that it ipso facto will make England's 50-over team worse, because I think actually that was done using a lot of money and very good coaching, playing an awful lot of international 50-over cricket, and those guys doing it over and over and over again to a plan with a captain. And that's replicatable, I guess.
I was hoping that you would say it was one and done, that England will never win another World Cup. I was really looking forward to that. Now that you say it's not terminal, it kind of sucks for someone that never wants to see England win anything in any sport, let alone cricket. Anyway, on that note, Daniel and Chris, thank you so much for being on the show. It's wonderful to hear from you both.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's been a real pleasure.
Take care.
And thank you. You too. And thank you all for listening. Check out 81allout.com for all our backlogs of podcasts and articles. Subscribe to us on iTunes and Spotify. Follow us on Twitter. And also check out our other podcast, which is The Other Banana, which is on the Indian regional movies. Thanks for listening.
He'll come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for 2. India home. Lords goes wide.